there can be gains in both ways. So I really feel that one clear message out there, people shouldn't be afraid of the carbon initiative that's been included in here. For the majority of the traits, by improving your efficiency in your herd, will improve the efficiency from the sustainability point of view in the environment.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and with the upcoming changes to the replacement and terminal indexes, on this week's episode I'm joined by Teagasc Beef Enterprise Leader Paul Crosson and Dr Margaret Kelleher from ICBF to discuss the changes being made and find out why, when and what impact it will have. Margaret, before we begin, perhaps can you review how the replacement and terminal index has progressed over the past decade?
We started with the terminal index back in the early 2000s, and I think what's important for everyone listening in is just to remember back then, at that time, the level of data recording was quite low. You know, our sire recording was only around 15%. And I suppose if anyone watched the webinar, they might have seen how we tracked the changes over the last 20 years. And they might be wondering, well, why was that even important that we mentioned that? So it's just good to clarify that, you know, in terms of getting a prediction or a picture really of where you want to breed your animals for more profitability in the future, we need to have data, number one. So, you know, if you've weighed an animal, the carcass weight comes in. But also what's very important then is actually knowing the parents. So only knowing 50% of the sires back then was actually very low. So the accuracy of the proofs would have been, you know, lower than what we have now. It's a very different story. So I suppose all that really started to change when we saw the different schemes coming in. So in 2007, we saw the Suckler Cow Welfare Scheme coming in. With that meant that people started recording more sires. And that really is where, you know, the increase in genetic gains started in terms of the terminal traits anyway. So we had faster genetic gain. So people were improving their terminal traits, their finishing cattle. But at the same time, when we were looking actually at the suckler cow herself, this was still on the decline. So we saw about 10 years from 2000 up to 2010 of this decline in our maternal kind of traits in the suckler herd. And that's when the replacement index was introduced for the very first time in 2011. So with that then, you know, I suppose at the time, people might have thought, well, you can't be increasing your terminal finishing traits as well as trying to get the traits where you want. You know, cows are efficient and, you know, don't cost too much to have in your farms and all that, and still producing the goods in terms of their weanlings and the produce coming off these animals. So really it was not until the BGP in 2015 that really things really started to change. You know, it was a massive scheme. You know, over 300 million was funded for this scheme. It meant that there was a lot of requirements on farmers, and they did it in terms of data recording. But the biggest thing was the genomics. Having a genotype on these animals meant we could link animals much more clearly, have much more information about them, and provide really improved genetic evaluations. And now in the last, I suppose, you know, since 2015 up to recently, we can see now that the genetic gain has completely changed in the national suckler herd. We can now see the terminal traits and the maternal traits are increasing at a rate of genetic gain that's similar to what we see in dairy. So it's a massive step in the last 20 years.
Most definitely, Margaret. And if the replacement index and terminal index are increasing, why are we bringing in these changes now at this stage?
Yeah, so I suppose the very first thing is we could always go faster. We can always make better genetic gain. I mean, there's so much variation out there in terms of the different breeds, different herds. And now that we have a massive, you know, database of over 2.5 million genotypes in the ICBF database, we can actually make faster gain. And to make faster gain, that means more profit for the farmers out there. So I suppose the three main changes that we're seeing now in these terminal and replacement indexes is, one, we want to bring in updates to the market prices. So Paul would have been the guru behind that in terms of the bioeconomic model, and also some work there from Donaberry and Teagasc, Moorpark, and they work together there to update the market prices. So again, it's a really good question. Like, why are you updating them now? They hadn't been updated in 8 years. So really the question might be, why didn't you update them over the last 8 years? So you must remember that, with a new scheme like BGP was very revolutionary at the time, and the market market prices were set for a futuristic point of view. So they kind of worked for the initial few years, but if you just take the last 2 or 3 years and what's happened out there in the industry, you had Brexit, you had COVID, and now you have these massive costs of production inflations in the last year or two that we've all seen in terms of concentrate and fertilizer prices, labour. All these prices have changed. So that is the number one crucial update to these indexes, is that we needed to get in more relevant economic values into these terminal and replacement indexes so that they make sense. They were out of date, so that was number one. Number two, and I touched on it a minute ago about we always want to make more genetic gain, because more genetic gain means more profit in the pockets for the farmers at the end of the day. So there's new traits, there's new methods to run evaluations, and there's ever increasing more genotypes coming in. So in terms of the new traits, there's a trait age at finish. So this is where, you want to finish your animals at an earlier age without, hitting the carcass weight or the finishing spec of the animal. So that is a new trait that's been introduced. And I mean, again, it's a massive inclusion to the indexes, because it means more profit for the farmer, but it also actually helps us in our sustainability aspect, which I'll get to in 1 second. Another new trait in there is TB resistance. So again, you can now find bulls that would be more suitable for your herd, that would be more resistant to getting TB. So we introduced that in the dairy side at the end of 2022 in the EBI, and we introduced it into the DBI in January. So it was just, it was in turn, the terminal replacement index also now getting it. And we also have carcass inspect traits in there, so factory specifications. So again, trying to breed for more conformed and profitable animals. So the third change, and one that maybe, the carbon initiative, I suppose, that's been brought into these beef indices, is that, at the end of the day, we have to be seen to be, trying to meet our targets as a whole industry, dairy and beef, and other industries outside of agriculture are also trying to meet their targets. So one way to do that would be through breeding. So for some traits, it's to, it goes hand in hand with profit. So, for example, if we can, have an earlier age of calving in our herd, in the suckler herd, so that's better profitability for the farmer, but it's also good for the environment. If you can finish your animals earlier, so age of finish being good for an earlier age of finish being good again for the profitability of the farmers and the environment. So there can be gains in both ways. So I really feel that one clear message out there, people shouldn't be afraid of the carbon initiative that's been included in here. For the majority of the traits, by improving your efficiency in your herd, will improve the efficiency from the sustainability point of view in the environment. So that's a really good thing to have in there. So they're the three main changes, Catherine, and that's why they're being introduced.
That's a great insight into it. I suppose, Paul, from a suckler farmer's point of view, hearing of these changes to the replacement and terminal index, what do you see as the main reasons for these changes?
Yeah, I suppose Mags has outlined that at a high level, the main changes that have been introduced to both indexes, the terminal and the replacement indexes. And if we bring them through to specifically address the cow traits within the replacement index, what we need to do here is really ruthlessly chase costs. Again, Mags mentioned the increase in costs in the last number of years. And if we look at the National Farm Survey data and look at suckler farms in particular, the last time we updated the indexes, the cost per suckler cow unit on suckler farms was just shy of €1,100. And the most recent year, 2022, when we have information, it's about €1,550. So we've seen a rapid increase in costs. And, as farmers, we've all experienced that in terms of fertilizer costs, feed costs, contractor costs, and so on. So translating that into the updates and the objectives in terms of this revision for the cow traits, we want to reduce the cost of feeding cows. We want to reduce finishing age. So in other words, the cost of finishing beef cattle. We want to improve fertility in the cow herd. And there's a cost element to that. Cows that calve earlier in the season have access to pasture earlier and reduce feed costs in terms of providing more grazed pasture rather than silage in the diet. And fewer difficult calvings. Again, there's a cost savings within that. At the same time, output value has also increased, and we have to recognise that in changes in the index. So we put a higher value on carcass weight, a higher value on live weight gain, and a higher value on weaning weights. And all of those come through as well in terms of the revisions to the economic values. And I suppose the final point in relation to the output values is fertility. We need to bear in mind that fertility is a really important aspect of good levels of output and high levels of output on suckler beef farms. Where you have a 390-day calving interval, which is the national average, you're producing less, on average, you're producing less than one weaning per year. So you're diluting your output on an annual basis. So all of those are the main objectives in terms of the updates on the cow traits within the replacement index.
Paul, Margaret mentioned earlier the carbon. Can you maybe explain why it's important? Currently, farmers aren't getting paid or charged for carbon, so why are we including it in the index?
You know, we discussed this long and hard in terms of the carbon and greenhouse gas elements within the indexes, and to what extent should it be included, and should it be included at all? If we look at the current policy agenda, there's a clear direction in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors of society. Equally, from a consumer point of view, consumers now are asking what is the carbon footprint of the food they're consuming, and what are food producers doing to reduce the carbon footprint of the food that's been put on the plate in front of them. So we have an obligation in that sense. But also, if we just look at the fundamentals of it, we can see the effect of climate change all around us. We've seen the extremes in weather patterns over the last number of years, and this year no more so than any year. So there is a clear demand of us to take steps to reduce the emissions from suckler beef systems. It also provides us with a real opportunity to future-proof our system. Yes, we're not currently either getting charged or paid for carbon reductions directly. But if we look around the world in terms of what governments are saying and are planning, things like carbon taxes, within Europe, we've seen a carbon farming platform starting to emerge. So it's quite clear, where the direction of travel is. Carbon is something that's viewed as being really important at a consumer and at a policy level, and certainly we can see it in terms of future markets. The final point, just in terms of carbon, I would say, Catherine, is that within the economic value changes, only 13% of the economic values are due to carbon. So it's moving us in the right direction, but it's certainly very much the minor player in terms of the changes that have occurred in the economic values. In other words, almost 90% of the changes in the economic values are due to conventional economics, if you like. So the cost of fertilizer, the cost of contractors, the cost of feed, all of those costs that we feel on a day-to-day basis, and that's the main driver of changes in the economic values.
And I know there are a huge amount of figures feeding into both of the indexes, but you might just elaborate on the new age at finishing trait that's included in the replacement index. Yeah,
and again, Mags has touched on this in terms of the need to include an age at finishing trait. Fundamentally, it's a trait to reduce costs on beef cattle farms. And it's not just reducing age at finish without taking cognizance of other aspects of finishing systems. Fatness remains really important within the context of reducing finishing age. So it's not reducing finishing age and having negative implications for commercial acceptability of carcasses. There is a minimum fatness score that animals will still have to reach, and that's taken into account. Equally, carcass weight. If we look at the trends within the sector over the last 10 years, we've taken 60 days, over 60 days, over 2 months reduction in age at finishing within the suckler herd, and no change in carcass weight. So we've already moved in a really positive direction, both from a cost perspective and also from a climate perspective. So the objective here would be to continue that trend, to reduce costs within systems, to maintain output and maintain the acceptability from a market perspective.
Thanks very much, Paul. Can you outline how the relative emphasis has changed, particularly for milk? It has gone from 14% to 11%. Are we now selecting for less milk going forward?
No, I think it's really important to emphasise that we are still selecting for increased milk yield in our suckler beef cows. We've added new traits, we've added age at finishing, we've added TB, we've added out of spec and so on traits within the indexes. Relative emphasis can only add up to 100%. Therefore, when you add new traits, some of the other traits are reduced slightly. So that's what's happening within for example, you've mentioned the milk one, and that's a good example. But we are still selecting for increased milk within our suckler beef herd. As I mentioned, with regard to the other traits and the overall emphasis within the indexes, output is still a key aspect of what we are trying to achieve here. We are still trying to increase the value of output from our suckler beef systems. So it's simply a matter of trying to include those new traits which we know are important, and that requires a reduction in some of the other traits.
And in relation to the cow emphasis, the cow is currently at 57% of the relative emphasis, and that's down from 61%. What does that mean in terms of breeding objectives going forward into the future?
Yeah, and I think that's a very similar point, I suppose. The overall relative emphasis on the cow side. So when you add fertility, milk, cull value, feed intake, and so on, it was at 61%. It's now down slightly to 57%. And that, looking at it from the flip side, the emphasis on the calf has increased, if you like. The emphasis on the value of the calf within the replacement index. So if we look at the replacement index, there are two components. There's the cow traits, in other words, the traits that the cow herself will exhibit, fertility, feed intake, and so on. And there's the traits that the calf produced by that cow will exhibit. So beef merit and calving traits and so on. So what that means is that we've included the new traits, TB, age at finishing, carbon, in terms of the cost of carrying that calf from an environmental perspective, and that has increased the emphasis to some extent on the calf traits. In other words, there's slightly more emphasis on the value and the impact of the calf within suckling systems.
And these changes have also impacted the terminal index.
Yeah. So within the terminal index, probably more modest changes, but we are still seeing some slight changes in relative emphasis. So again, if you look at some of the new traits coming into the carbon or into the terminal index, weight has gone down slightly, in the context of including TB, age at finishing, carbon, and so on. So some of our beef merit traits go down slightly in order to enable those other traits to be included within the terminal index.
I suppose in summary, Margaret, going forward, farmers that are listening in, when the proofs are run on the 21st of November for participants that's in SCEP and farmers that will be purchasing cows or bulls in the coming months, what impact can they expect to see?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. So in terms of the SCEP herds, I mean, again, the proofs will be live. All these changes that we've spoken about here will be for the first time live from the 21st of November, so 3 o'clock that day. And people might be worried that, their animals mightn't qualify as 4 and 5 star. But in fact, that's not actually the case. For 84% of the animals in SCEP herds, they actually remain 4 and 5 star. So really, I do think, in case anyone is really worried out there that there's huge changes, that is not the case at all. And on top of that, actually, there's even 7% of animals that were originally below this threshold will actually get into this threshold. So there's actually a very small proportion of animals that will fall out. But the main message here is the majority will stay 4 and 5 star, and that there is an opportunity for some to go up as well as go down. But you're talking about only around 7%. So going forward, I think anyone who's purchasing animals, make sure to be going, if they can wait at all to 21st November when they get the new proofs, that will be the new index out there, be a terminal replacement, and it'll have all these new traits that, again, as we spoke about in the last few minutes there, are there to improve profitability, are more relevant to you in terms of their market prices, and also have a bit of this carbon efficiency built in.
Thanks, Margaret. And farmers can access those proofs on the 21st of November. How can they go about accessing them? So
for the SCEP herds, again, it'll be all there on their Herd Plus accounts. So we usually publish there around 3 o'clock. So, if anyone has any issues or problems, please do contact the Herd Plus support team or one of your Teagasc advisors.
That's great. Thanks, Margaret. And Paul, you'll be covering these details and changes in more detail at the Teagasc National Beef Conference.
Yeah, the Teagasc National Beef Conference is on the 21st of November, Tuesday the 21st of November. It's in the Sheerwater in Ballinasloe, commencing at 5 p.m. This topic, I'll cover this topic in a presentation at the beef conference. And we would really be encouraging beef farmers, industry stakeholders all to attend, as well as covering the changes in the beef breeding indexes. Ellen Fitzpatrick from Teagasc and Johnstown Castle will cover the latest results from the dairy beef heifer systems in Johnstown Castle. And Maria Guilbenzu from AHI will cover the recent work on IBR. There's a second session within that. That's in the first session at the beef conference. There is a second session where we take a more global approach to where the beef sector is. So we look at the greenhouse gas emissions on cattle demonstration farms, and Siobhan Kavanagh will give a perspective from the Signpost programme. Anil Out will cover the certification schemes in France. So we mentioned, carbon farming and how farmers can get value from steps they're taking to reduce the carbon emissions from their farms. There's a really interesting perspective from France where they are looking at some pilot schemes of how this might turn out into the future. And the final presentation at the conference will be Rupert Claxton. And we're obviously focusing to some extent on carbon within the indexes, also within the carbon farming schemes, but ultimately beef price and input costs is what drives the economics on beef farms. And Rupert will cover the world outlook for beef prices and input costs. And we need to remember that, we export 90 to 95% of the beef that we produce. So what happens in the world market is absolutely crucial to the economics of beef farm systems in Ireland. So that's the beef conference, Tuesday the 21st of November in the Shearwater in Ballinasloe, commencing at 5 p.m.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'll include in the podcast text the link for further details on the upcoming conference on the 21st of November at 5 p.m. Thanks very much, Paul and Margaret, for joining me on the show.
Catherine.
You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan and thanks for listening.